The notorious 187 Homicide is one of those wrestlers who comes off as legitimately unstable, someone who would hurt you. At a build height of 5'10", this is not a physically imposing man. You don't need to be big to be dangerous. It's what a person is willing to do that is scary, and Homicide seems willing to do a lot. On the other hand, Samoa Joe does have quite a bit of size that, along with his abundant repertoire of moves, holds, and strikes, makes him a menacing individual in his own right. When these two forces cross paths, a combustible atmosphere is created, and it becomes only a matter of time before things blow up. So join me today as I take a look at Ring of Honor's rivalry of Samoa Joe and Homicide from beginning to end. We begin in 2002 at Glory by Honor. Samoa Joe enters the Ring of Honor scene as a paid hitman of the Prophecy, a faction led by Christopher Daniels. Joe's target, Low Key. These two wrestlers beat the snot out of each other. I'm not exaggerating. This match is well known for its brutality. Low Key manages the big W, but Joe losing his first ROH match isn't bad because he had a great showing. Fans can see Joe is a threat to the rest of the roster. On that very same show, Steve Corino and Homicide have a tag team match against the Backseat Boys. Corino gets selfish and breaks up an attempted pinfall by Homicide. His partner, accidentally hits him. Corino returns the favor. This causes Homicide to lose. There's a six-man tag: Donovan Morgan, Christopher Daniels, and Samoa Joe versus Doug Williams, Low Key, and Homicide. This is Joe's first time wrestling the notorious 187, and with a coquina clutch, Samoa Joe is able to defeat him. Homicide's night doesn't end here though. He sharpens a fork and finds Steve Corino backstage, where he tries to take Corino's eye. This is where things get personal, as Steve Corino is a friend to Samoa Joe, and so Samoa Joe and Homicide wrestle their first singles match. Joe makes sure Homicide feels what he's dishing out. It's an eye for an eye. Obviously, Homicide is not one to suffer such punishment without a retaliatory flurry. Things get a bit wild out on the floor. Homicide takes a Death Valley driver and lariat, but a rope break spares him. He puts the pressure back on Joe, but the coquina clutch that beat Homicide before stifles a comeback. Things become very, very intense before Joe finds himself rolled up and pinned. Homicide next meets Joe in a four-way match, which also includes Easy Money and BJ Whitmer. This is a big deal because the winner will wrestle Xavier for the Ring of Honor Championship. Joe and Homicide are equally ambitious to once again lock up. Joe flies outside onto Homicide. Chops are thrown at Joe, which are brushed off. Joe lays in some extremely aggressive knees. Joe ends this contest by submitting Easy Money, as Homicide is too late to break things up. Homicide tears into the victor after the contest, as both men need separated. This is a damn near riot as the entire locker room pours out. Later, Homicide lets it be known he has a posse backing him up, and they're willing to do some very bad things to Joe. And here we get a look at who they are. It is declared, my blood, my flesh, my flesh. Homicide's associates cause a ruckus in Philadelphia. Jack Victory becomes involved, and the man known as Julius Smokes is ganged up on. Homicide and the Hit Squad rush out. This becomes a six-man tag of Samoa Joe, C.W. Anderson, and Jack Victory versus Homicide and the Hit Squad. Mafia's been wanting a piece of Joe, and he gets it, as he and his partner Monster Mac take it to him. These dangerous men did not come to play. Becky Bayless, a member of Homicide's crew, gets involved with Simply Luscious. This is chaos. Homicide then delivers a cop killer to Luscious, who, by the way, is Steve Corino's girlfriend. A disqualification is finally called after C.W. Anderson spinebusters Homicide on a garbage can. Members of Homicide's crew rush the ring. This guy has a machete. As for Samoa Joe, due to the four-way he won, he gets the championship match with Xavier later on the same card. Although it was Christopher Daniels who brought Joe into ROH, he has since broken away from the Prophecy. It's here where Samoa Joe begins his historic Ring of Honor Championship reign. With winning championship gold comes the duty of defending it. Accompanied by Julius Smokes, Homicide prepares to challenge Samoa Joe for the Ring of Honor Championship. Even though things have been heated, Homicide adheres to the Code of Honor. Joe is not impressed by what Homicide brings, but getting dropped on your head will mess anyone up. There's a receipt for that. Homicide eats one Olé kick, but tonight Joe's serving seconds. Homicide pulls out a table, but he pretty much puts himself through it. After that, Joe uses the Powerbomb STF combo and works it into a coquina clutch. Low Key arrives ringside and encourages Homicide not to give in. The challenger begins to stagger Joe, but a big knee crumbles him. He barely answers the count of 10. Joe's playing games at this point. When low-key slaps Homicide, the stone-cold killer awakens from his slumber, and Joe almost becomes a victim. But he's not going to die just yet. Everything besides the kitchen sink is hurled at Joe, and officials consider stopping the contest. Homicide shows no mercy. There's no hesitation at all, and Homicide prepares for the death blow. However, Julia Smokes and Loki bicker outside. This distracts Homicide just enough that Joe nails an avalanche muscle buster. Just like that, it's done. Joe mockingly shakes Homicide's hand to get in Loki's head. Homicide is helped up as fans cheer his efforts. When Joe and Homicide meet again, the ROH title is not on the line. This is a no-holds-barred match to simply allow these wrestlers the opportunity to beat the daylights out of one another and see who the better man is. After all, one must wonder, had Homicide not been distracted in the title match, would he be carrying around the belt right now? Julia Smokes brings out the table. Joe makes sure it isn't used on him. Joe locks in an STF, and he does not have to release the hold as Homicide reaches the ropes. Julius's smack talk angers Joe enough to let go. Joe wants another avalanche muscle buster. Homicide resists it, hits an ace crusher, and starts cooking. Joe's not going down to that. He's not going down to a backdrop driver either. Samoa Joe fires up. He hits the big knee that almost knocked Homicide out last time. Homicide begins to stir. Joe goes to pummel him, but it's he who gets pummeled. A Yakuza kick knocks Joe loopy. Homicide wraps a noose around Joe's neck. Homicide pulls as hard as he can. Joe passes out. Referees surround him to guard against any further atrocities. Homicide lays the ROH title atop Joe, letting the big man know his reign is in jeopardy. Homicide takes some time off from Ring of Honor, but when he comes back, you'd better believe Joe and the ROH title are in his line of sight. You'll notice there's no Julia Smokes present. That's because Joe took him out when he sent word of Homicide's return. Joe locks in an STF early. Homicide looks unsure how to approach him. Already frustrated, Homicide throws a fan's chair. He also allows fans to get under his skin. Something is different about Homicide tonight. Even though he has 2 singles wins over Joe, he almost appears to be off his game. This is Joe's match. The champion is in control until a pile driver grants the challenger a very brief reprieve before Joe decides to apply more pressure and begin to wrap this bout up. Homicide hits an ace crusher out of nowhere though. He follows it up with a lariat. Joe kicks out, but the champ's finally in trouble. The men struggle until Homicide catches Joe with a roll-up, the way he beat him in their first match. The bell rings, but Paul Turner insists Joe kicked out and the match is not over. Homicide can't accept this. Joe continues to fight, but the lights go out. The next thing you know, Samoa Joe is blinded by a fireball. Homicide begins to attack more officials. The locker room empties in an attempt to stop him from doing further harm. This is absolute chaos. Due to the fireball, Joe's face is temporarily burnt. He invites Homicide into a men's restroom to continue their feud in private. They beat each other unconscious. Homicide's chase towards gold continues in Philadelphia, as he's accompanied to the ring with a now recovered Julia Smokes. When the champion enters the ring, he's met with streamers. Homicide jumps Joe and Julia Smokes even joins the fight. There's no disqualification for this because it's been decided that there must be a winner. This means the referee's hands are tied as things get wild. Homicide even jams a fork into Joe's head, a very disturbing visual. The champion's at a big disadvantage here. That isn't to say he isn't dangerous. He wants that avalanche muscle buster, a surefire win. Homicide shifts the move just enough that it hurts Joe. He follows up with a lariat that Joe kicks out of. Homicide hits a backdrop driver pile driver combo, but that's not enough either. Homicide keeps targeting the neck. There's a method to his madness. The referee finally takes Homicide's fork away. Homicide jaw jacks with Todd Sinclair only to walk straight into an island driver. He kicks out, but Samoa Joe keeps on him. Joe nails a brainbuster. Homicide is pinned. He was so close, but the ROH title continues to elude his grasp. Fans show respect to Homicide. He pretty much tells them all where they can go. He does not want their cheers. At World Title Classic, Samoa Joe is presented with a brand new Ring of Honor World Title belt for all of his hard work as a fighting champion. The prestige of that championship is even further elevated as he wrestles CM Punk to an hour draw. This incredibly special moment is absolutely ruined when Homicide ambushes Joe and causes a general disruption. No one is safe when Homicide gets like this. He lashes out like a rabid dog. Worst of all, he walks off with a brand new championship. This brings us to the Survival of the Fittest event. Homicide qualifies for the Survival of the Fittest match by using an Ace Crusher and Lariat to pin Jay Briscoe. The way Jay landed after that Lariat leaves his neck injured. Homicide shows no remorse and Mark Briscoe wants his head for hurting his brother. Later, Joe qualifies for the main event when he beats Matt Striker with an Island Driver. Afterward, Homicide pokes the bear, flaunting the ROH championship he stole. Joe rushes Homicide and the men have a scuffle. Joe tells Homicide that he needs to prepare because this feud will soon come to an end. As far as the Survival of the Fittest match, we have Mark Briscoe, Colt Cabana, Austin Aries, Bryan Danielson, and of course the ROH champion and Homicide. An embarrassment of riches, to be honest. As much as Joe wants Homicide, Mark Briscoe wants him more after what transpired earlier. Homicide does have a chance to get his hands on Joe, but he decides against a head-on collision. Funnily enough, Joe is the first man eliminated when Colt Cabana catches him with a flash pin. Mark Briscoe uses a shooting star press to get rid of Colt. Homicide and Mark eliminate each other with a double pin, and Bryan Danielson submits Austin Aries to become the Survival of the Fittest winner. With Ricky Reyes and Rocky Romero joining Julius Smokes and Homicide, they form the Rottweilers, a very dangerous stable. When Joe needs backup, the Briscoes, who have their own issues with the Rottweilers, answer the call. Samoa Joe and the Briscoes had their own bloody rivalry, but the three men are on the same page to wrestle Homicide, Rocky Romero, and Ricky Reyes in a six-man tag, or rather six-man war as it is appropriately billed. Julius Smokes eats an Olay kick almost immediately. Joe, as usual, is a pleasure to watch. Reyes kicks out of a Briscoe doomsday device. Mark tries to finish him with a shooting star press. He screws it up and nearly dies. I'm sure he's concussed here, but Mark keeps fighting. He goes for another shooting star because he probably doesn't know what he's doing. Homicide terrorizes Loopy Mark. Big Joe makes the tag and says he'll take everyone on. As if Mark hadn't suffered enough, Homicide fireballs his face. Jay grabs his brother and heads to the back. The Rottweilers are disqualified. Regardless, they continue to beat up on Joe. Jay Briscoe runs back out and gets some licks in, but the numbers game is overwhelming. Then suddenly, a very familiar theme plays. The ROH legend Low-Ki is back. Last time he was around, he wasn't thrilled with the direction Homicide was taking. Low-Ki, a man of discipline, a man of integrity, a man of honor. Nah, forget it. He joins his buddies and trashes Samoa Joe. The champ still has some fight left in him, but he is eventually subdued. Homicide gets one final match for the Ring of Honor Championship during Samoa Joe's reign. If he can't get the job done tonight, that's it. This is a must-win situation for him. Julius Smokes distracts Joe. Rocky Romero does the same. Low-Ki grabs Joe's foot. The amount of backup Homicide has is criminal. The referee ejects the Rottweilers because things were getting ridiculous. This is going to be a fair fight. Well, okay, not quite. After all, this is a desperate man. With a drop toe hold, he avoids the Olay kick. He tries for one of his own. It doesn't work out, and Joe is able to get his kick in. Speaking of kicks, Homicide takes a lot of them. This last opportunity is slipping through his fingers. A blockbuster followed by a neckbreaker keeps Homicide in this. Homicide hits not one, not two, but three lariats in a row for a near fall. Homicide takes off the elbow pad for a final lariat, but Joe isn't allowing it to take place. Joe follows up with a muscle buster. Unbelievably, the challenger doesn't stay down. Homicide doesn't even know where he is after that. An Island Driver should finish him, but again he kicks out. Joe goes to what defeated Homicide in their first encounter in that six-man tag from 2002. It's the Coquina Clutch, and with that, the champion retains his title. Joe refuses to release the hold. Wrestlers and officials try to pull the champ off because Homicide's well-being is now in jeopardy. The Rottweilers jump Joe. He's forced to free his rival from the clutch. What comes around goes around because Low-Ki chokes Joe out. He then gives the ROH belt the ol' Haktui and spits on that thing. Homicide and Joe lock up one last time in 2004. It isn't for the belt, of course. This is a non-title three-way involving CM Punk. The reasons for this match are simple. Joe and Homicide still hate each other, Punk and Joe are in the middle of their series, and Punk wasn't happy with Homicide's behavior after the hour draw for the championship. Homicide introduces a fork, but it ends up being used on him by Joe. Punk tries incapacitating Joe so he can pick apart a wounded Homicide, but the big man's not going to allow it. Joe traps Homicide in an STF just so he can stab him with the fork some more. The referee takes the utensil away, so Joe rips at Homicide with his bare hands. The difference maker here is CM Punk hitting Joe with the Pepsi plunge. Homicide swiftly lariats Punk, hops on Joe, and gets a pinfall victory over the big guy. If not for being barred from future title shots against Joe, this right here would have earned him another opportunity. Samoa Joe continues to clash with the Rottweilers. The big rematch between he and Low-Ki doesn't happen. Austin Aries and Low-Ki wrestle in a #1 contenders match to a 20-minute draw. Low-Ki refuses to wrestle 5 extra minutes, making Austin Aries the #1 contender by default. At Final Battle, Low-Ki and Bryan Danielson have a physical contest. The Rottweilers get involved and the usual bedlam ensues. ROH officials, tired of this nonsense, suspend Low-Ki indefinitely. In the main event of that very show, Samoa Joe's historic reign finally ends at the hands of Austin Aries. We move on to 2005 and beyond. Stay tuned because Homicide and Samoa Joe aren't through with each other, not by a long shot. Ricky Reyes, Rocky Romero, and Homicide wrestle Vordell Walker, Bryan Danielson, and Samoa Joe as a trios tournament takes place. Not only does Homicide have bad blood with Danielson, but Samoa Joe is all too eager to tear into the notorious 187. The match breaks down. Bryan Danielson is beaten down outside, so Big Joe wipes both Homicide and Julius Smokes out. This leaves Vordell Walker alone to take the pin from Ricky Reyes. Jay Lethal becomes something of a protege sitting beneath the learning tree of Samoa Joe. Samoa Joe wrestles Jay Lethal for the ROH Peer title at Manhattan Mayhem. The teacher defeats the student, and Samoa Joe is once again a champion in Ring of Honor. The men embrace after their fight, but the Rottweilers interrupt, and Low-Ki is with them. Lethal and Joe are subjected to a brutal, long-lasting attack. Low-Ki slaps the taste out of Lethal's mouth. Joe tries to get up. Homicide immediately pounces. The Rottweilers leave both men in a state of squalor. Low-Ki and Homicide try to intimidate the world champion Austin Aries later in the night. The two are jumped by Samoa Joe and Jay Lethal. As the fight carries on, a referee runs out, the bell rings, and we have ourselves a tag team match. Jay Lethal ends up becoming cut off from Joe as Homicide and Low-Ki both have their way with a youngster. Homicide goes for the kill with a lariat. Jay Lethal responds with a dragon suplex before compromising Low-Ki in order to tag in his partner. Joe unleashes an incredible barrage of offense. Jay Lethal isn't quite done either. Homicide spares Low-Ki a muscle buster. An assisted cop killer scores Homicide a win over Jay. The Rottweilers stand united and triumphant this night. That cop killer was detrimental to Lethal's neck. When Homicide defeats James Gibson at The Future Is Now, it becomes evident the notorious 187 has some cruel intentions. Jay Lethal, proving to be neck strong, comes to the rescue. He rips his brace off and gives Homicide exactly what he's had coming to him. Homicide's posse runs Jay off. Regardless, he did what he came to do. Jay Lethal and Low-Ki wrestle one-on-one. Low-Ki resorts to dishonest tactics, but a dragon suplex is Lethal's reply. That would have been it if not for Julius Smokes causing a DQ. Homicide rescues Smokes from a reciprocation. That suplex did quite a number on Low-Ki. Homicide helps him to the back. There's a four-corner survival. Samoa Joe versus Homicide versus James Gibson versus Austin Aries. There's hesitation from the notorious 187 to wrestle Joe. Joe gets the better of him after swatting him like a fly. Homicide quickly tags out to Austin Aries. Joe gets his hands back on him later on. Nothing good comes from this exchange for Homicide. It doesn't go great for him out on the floor either. Homicide finally shines against Joe in the final moments of this match, but when Gibson sends Homicide outside, Austin Aries capitalizes and pins Samoa Joe. Homicide gets his hands on Samoa Joe's protege, Jay Lethal, in a match. The young man is ever so impressive each and every opportunity he is given to showcase the goods. This is relaxed roles though. Homicide is free to unleash a lot of hatred. After both individuals smash through a table, Homicide's thugs begin their encroachment. Homicide kicks out of a dragon suplex and then nails a big-time lariat to defeat Lethal. There's a 6-man tag. Homicide, Ricky Reyes, and Loki versus Samoa Joe, Jay Lethal, and James Gibson. The Rottweilers take advantage of Jay Lethal's tender neck. Loki kicks him square in the face. Jay is in real bad shape after that. Joe and Gibson aren't sure he can carry on. Joe can barely keep his anger bottled up. Homicide wants to continue working over Jay Lethal, but he hits a suplex and gets the hell out of Dodge. Joe's tagged in and he sees red. He attempts to send the Rottweilers to the dog pound. This is followed by Gibson getting a hot tag and going to town. Loki makes the save for his team. Lethal recovers and badly wants a piece of Loki. He almost hits that dragon suplex. Homicide stops him and then attempts to re-injure Lethal's neck. Gibson makes the save. Loki crashes and burns into his own partner. Now is the chance for Joe's team. Homicide eats an Olay kick. He's softened up for the Tiger Driver. Thanks to one of his thugs, Homicide turns the table on Gibson and puts him away. The Rottweilers have pulled it off again. Samoa Joe and Jay Lethal start out hot and heavy when colliding with Loki and Homicide in tag team action. Lethal's head and neck are once again targeted. The Kid can't catch a break against these thugs. After receiving a pile driver, Lethal avoids Loki's double stomp and a leg lariat leads to Big Joe getting tagged in and wrecking his foes. Lethal does hit his dragon suplex on Loki. However, Homicide elbow drops the ref to stop the 3 count. The match is thrown out, but these 4 men continue to fight. Lethal steps up to Loki, but he falls short of exacting revenge. Joe's young protege doesn't know the word quit. At Glory by Honor 4, an injured Jay Lethal is determined to settle the score against Loki. A victory against the ROH legend must be earned, as Loki doesn't allow anyone a free pass. Joe takes out Julius Smokes to keep the contest clean, but Homicide and Reyes jump the big man. Colt Cabana provides backup for Joe, and would you believe it? Jay Lethal actually gets a pinfall victory here. Some things are bigger than blood feuds. At this point, Samoa Joe and Loki are partnered together. Kenta Kobashi coming to Ring of Honor means personal issues must be put on the back burner. Homicide is actually chosen to be the Japanese legend's partner. He goes along with the program and wrestles against Loki as if he were any other opponent. It's interesting to see Loki and Joe cooperating here. Well, at least for the most part. The match ends with Loki eating a burning lariat before getting pinned. Now, if you're expecting Joe and Homicide to continue their feud, that doesn't actually happen. The rivalry dissolves going forward. Their paths do cross again, perhaps not in the way you'd expect. Samoa Joe and Homicide find themselves on the same side when going to war against the invaders of CZW. In fact, Homicide steps up and becomes the MVP of ROH because of his willingness to stoop to the same levels of depravity as the hardcore outsiders. It's because of this that when Homicide and the Briscoes renew their rivalry, Samoa Joe decides that he'll have the back of the notorious 187. One of professional wrestling's undeniable truths is that the more brutal the opponent, the better he or she is as an ally. This actually extends outside of wrestling if you think about it. At Glory by Honor, 2 men who have come dangerously close to destroying one another now bring their hate and venom and direct it toward the Briscoes. With stereo dives, a message is sent that Joe and Homicide are ready to begin a whole new chapter. As I alluded to earlier, Joe and the Briscoes know each other very well as enemies, so this isn't foreign territory. Neither is the physicality here. Homicide scores the win for his team with his devastating cop kill. The Briscoes are probably the greatest tag team in ROH history, so that's kind of a big deal. The tag team GOATs are loath to allow such an upset to go unchallenged. The Briscoes clash with Joe and Homicide again. This time it's Falls Count Anywhere. There are chairs fighting in the crowd and, well, more chairs. You put the Briscoes in a hardcore environment and you know what to expect. Holy crap, dude. Mark Briscoe hits a shooting star press off of a semi. This leaves Joe with a bum leg. Homicide battles the brothers alone. He does what he can, but no one man is capable of winning this. A spiked J Driller puts the notorious 187 to rest this night. Jim Cornette has had it out for Homicide, and he's adamant that the notorious 187 stay far away from the ROH World title. Adam Pearce is used as an instrument to see this through, along with Steve Corino, someone who's been a great enemy to Homicide, as has been touched upon already. These men may be a formidable obstacle, but Homicide still has Samoa Joe as an ally and tag team partner. Together, they have a wild tag team match against Jim Cornette's henchmen. Homicide is as wicked as ever to the delight of fans. He's soon isolated and dominated, but Joe's always great when it comes to hot tags. Shane Hagedorn, a suck-up crony to authority, assists Corino and Pearce. The King of Old School is splashed through a table. Homicide uses Jim Cornette's racket against his own men. Shane Hagedorn gets what he deserves too. Samoa Joe puts Steve Corino through a second table before hitting a muscle buster on Adam Pearce. Homicide follows through with a lariat and pins him. Shane Hagedorn interjects himself again, so Joe takes him to the backstage area to use as the proverbial woodshed. However, this leaves Homicide alone. The Briscoe brothers use this opening to pounce. They then guard the aisleway as Steve Corino suffocates Homicide with a plastic bag until his body becomes lifeless. The Briscoes team with Steve Corino to fight BJ Whitmer, Homicide, and Samoa Joe. Homicide wishes to commit his namesake on Corino. When it comes to BJ Whitmer, the Briscoes do to him what they do best. They also keep Homicide in check so he can't finish Corino. Joe's not immune to brotherly double teams either. Corino attempts to knock Homicide out with nuts. The ref catches it, but the Snake uses a second pair to clock Homicide. A spiked J Driller is next, and he's not kicking out of that. What's next between the Briscoes and Joe and Homicide is a Falls Count Anywhere tag team elimination match. Joe and Homicide again display a united front. The Briscoes respond just the same. Eat your heart out, Claudio. Joe performs a giant swing in the crowd. Next is a fun-filled game of redneck hockey. Mark Briscoe finds a high place and can't fight the urge to shoot off of it. Homicide returns to the ring where Jay Briscoe survives an ace crusher. Everyone begins hitting hard and emptying their fuel tanks. Julius Smokes lights a cigar. Homicide uses it to burn Mark. A low blow follows as Homicide sets up his finisher. Jay tries to intervene, but Joe catches him. What follows is the Briscoes feasting on stereo finishers as they're both eliminated at once. Now, spoiler alert, but if you know about Ring of Honor's history, you know Homicide does finish his Cinderella story in winning the top prize in the company. And finally, we arrive here. Samoa Joe versus Homicide. The shoe's on the other foot now. Samoa Joe is the challenger to the throne. This isn't about hate. This is about a title and who the better man is. The code of honor is respected. We've seen these men drunk on bile and venom in their past battles, but right here, right now, we're watching two men who have mutual respect for one another. However, Homicide cannot ignore what's come before. The challenger is a very dangerous man. If Homicide ignores his killer instinct, he won't be walking away from this with the gold. The same goes for Joe. The Samoan gradually becomes more and more aggressive. Homicide stops a second Olay kick with a chair. Todd Sinclair must check on Joe. Homicide furthers the head trauma with a pile driver on the floor. It's clear now what must be done. It's the only way. The targeted attack carries on. The ST Joe is countered until it is not. Joe's chance of a comeback is potentially ruined with a huge DDT. He doesn't allow his body the luxury of rest. Joe remains steadfast as Homicide survives the STF. The men find themselves back up on top. The avalanche muscle buster is avoided. Instead, Joe takes an ace crusher. He kicks out, but a second ace crusher, accompanied by lariat after lariat after lariat, is the key needed to unlock the door of freedom. Homicide's greatest rival has been toppled, and he is still the Ring of Honor champion. It's March of 2007. Samoa Joe is moving on from Ring of Honor. In fact, this is his farewell match. Who should Joe's final opponent be? None other than the notorious 187 Homicide. There's no title at stake this time. Samoa Joe soaks in the atmosphere as chants of "Thank you, Joe," and "He's a legend" pour forth from a very emotional but respectful crowd. They're right, of course. Samoa Joe absolutely is an ROH legend. That will not be questioned. To avoid Homicide flying through the ropes, the big guy heads to the bar for refreshments. Homicide says he's not interested in beer, but if Joe wants to smoke, they'll talk. When Homicide goes for a crossbody, Joe simply steps out of the way. Homicide can't comprehend it. Joe offers a friendly handshake, but Homicide's growing testy. Julius Smokes gets up to his old tricks. Homicide says that works for him. Just about everything you want from a Samoa Joe match is here. There are even a couple of things you wouldn't expect. This isn't like the last day of school. Homicide will not allow for a cakewalk. If Joe wants to leave ROH alive, he's going to have to work for it. Homicide's well aware what defeated his rival last time. Focusing on the head and neck, he works toward it. Homicide avoids a muscle buster. He goes for a big lariat, but his opponent locks in the coquina clutch. If not for Julius Smokes, that would have been it. Homicide is willing to stoop low for a win. It will not end like that. Joe does get to nail his muscle buster, but Julius Smokes again saves Homicide's bacon. One way to keep the pest from further irritation is to kick his face off. Joe goes for a second Olay kick, but Homicide shoots out like a missile out of nowhere. A lariat follows. It's not enough. An ace crusher from the top will be though, but wait. Joe actually gets Homicide in position for the avalanche muscle buster. The ultimate Samoa Joe finisher gets the job done. Fans give thanks through applause and chants while Samoa Joe embraces his friend. As he's announced the victor, Joe receives a standing ovation. Joe says even though he'll be gone, Ring of Honor will be in good hands with a locker room full of hungry talent just itching to fill the void he'll leave behind. On that note, Homicide's time in the promotion ends shortly after this too, at least for a while. There's no better way than this to put a bow on the rivalry of Joe and Homicide. Their blood, sweat, and tears helped make Ring of Honor what it was, what it would become, and hopefully someday what it will be again. We'll see about that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you liked it. Until next time, enjoy some pro wrestling.